The monster market was where the unwanted went to disappear. And as Kael stood among the condemned, men and women whose crimes or curses had made them liabilities to their villages, unlike the others, he didn't bow his head. He held it high. Let them see his eyes. Gold. Molten. Wrong. The crowd pulled back like water from fire. Monster touched. They whispered. Why would anyone claiming that come willingly? They weren't wrong to wonder. Behind those eyes lived something ancient, something the village of Elderbrook had feared since the night he was born under blood-red moon. Something that made monsters bow, and men reach for weapons. He would not be chosen here. He would not be chosen anywhere. Then the alpha beast emerged from the tree line. And stopped. You, it said, not with hunger, but with recognition. Neither of them understood yet what that moment would cost them both. Welcome to nature's hot tales, where every story burns wild and runs deep. Whether you're here for the monsters, the magic, or the moments that hit different, you're in the right place. Drop your location below. I want to know where in the world my readers are watching from. Now let's get into it. The moon turned red the night Kael was born, and the monsters didn't wait. They always came after midnight, when the crimson light had climbed high enough to pull them from the Blackwood like rot from old wood. The village of Elderbrook had learned to bar doors, douse fires, and pray in silence until dawn. They had a rhythm with their terror. A schedule. But that night, the growling began at dusk. Torches flared along the northern wall. Men grabbed pitchforks they knew were useless. Children were shoved into root cellars. And in a small hut near the center of the village, a woman screamed, not from the monsters, but from the particular agony of bringing something new into a world that was already on fire. The midwife did not come out for a long time. When she finally stepped through the door, her apron was dark with blood, her face the color of ash. The men on the wall were still shouting. The beasts were still circling. But somehow the square had gone quiet, as though everyone had turned, without deciding to, toward that single pale woman standing in a hut doorway holding a wrapped bundle. It's a boy, she whispered. No one moved. Because the child's eyes were open, which was unusual enough, and they were gold. Not brown catching torchlight. Not some trick of shadow. Gold. Molten and steady, like two coins pulled fresh from a forge. In Elderbrook, gold eyes meant only one thing. Monster touched. The mother, Mara, pulled her son to her chest and said nothing. She had heard the whispers before he was even born, had felt the village's suspicion the moment her pregnancy showed. Now she simply held him, one hand cradling his skull, and stared at the wall above the midwife's head as though the rest of the room did not exist. She would not give them her expression. She would not give them that. Outside, strangely, the growling had stopped. Kael grew up understanding silence better than language. Not the peaceful kind, the loaded kind. The silence of a conversation that died the moment he entered a room. The silence of mothers pulling sons indoors as he passed. The silence of his father, Aldrich, sitting at the table each evening with a clay cup he refilled too many times, staring at the wall as though Kael was simply furniture he regretted purchasing. The monsters destroyed half the village every season. They tore apart the mill twice. They dragged 2 goats and 1 old shepherd into the Blackwood and left behind only boot prints and screaming. They took the roof off the Fenner family home on a Tuesday and left the family standing in the rain, weeping among their ruined belongings. They never touched Kael's house. Not once. Not a scratch on the door, not a claw mark on the shutters. He didn't understand it then. He only understood what it cost him. When he was 7, he helped the Fenner boys stack new timber for their wall. They let him carry the wood but wouldn't let him touch the posts. Your hands might curse it, the older one said, and the younger one laughed, and both of them looked at him with something colder than cruelty, something close to pity mixed with disgust, which was somehow worse. Beast Boy, they called him. Not to wound, or not only to wound. The way children use names they've heard adults use, not fully understanding the blade they're holding. He heard his father the night before his 9th birthday, through the thin wall that separated the sleeping area from the kitchen. Aldrich's voice was blurred with drink, but the words were sharp enough. We should have left him in the forest. Before the village decided he was our problem. Mara said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, he is not a problem. He is our son. Kael pressed his back against the wall and did not cry. He had already learned that crying changed nothing in Elderbrook. He stared at the ceiling and filed the sentence somewhere deep, in the place where children store the things that will shape them without their permission. The attack on his 10th birthday was the worst in living memory. They came at noon, unheard of. Dozens of them pouring through the northern gate before the watch bell had finished ringing. Men with pitchforks lasted seconds. The smithy collapsed. Fire jumped from thatch to thatch across the eastern row of houses. Kael stood frozen at the edge of the square, watching adults become small and helpless, watching everything ordinary reveal its fragility. Then the skull-faced one found him. It was enormous, the largest beast he had ever seen, its head a white, bleached horror of fused bone and gaping eye sockets. It moved through the chaos like it owned the ground beneath its feet, and it walked directly toward Kael with the steady patience of something that did not need to hurry. Kael didn't run. He wasn't brave. His legs simply stopped working. The creature lowered its head until its face was level with his. Hot breath. The smell of deep forest and old blood. Those hollow sockets somehow looking at him. Then it stepped back, bowed its massive skull toward the earth, and retreated into the smoke. The whole village had seen it. He knew, watching their faces turn toward him, slowly, like a tide changing, that something had just ended. Whatever fragile tolerance they had maintained, whatever uneasy peace Mara's ferocity had brought him, was gone. They came for him at dawn. 4 elders and the chief, and enough villagers behind them to feel like a verdict. His mother stood in the doorway. She argued until her voice broke. She wept, which Kael had never seen, and somehow that was the most frightening thing of the entire morning. They bound his wrists with rope anyway. Before they dragged him out, Mara pressed something cold into his palm and closed his fingers over it. A pendant, iron, shaped like a sun with too many points. Her mouth was at his ear. "No matter what they call you," she said, her voice steady now in a way that cost her everything, "you are my son." The chief did not look at her. "If the monsters spare him," he told the crowd, "then he belongs to them." They walked him to the forest's edge as the sun finished rising, left him tied to a post driven into the soil where the tree line began, and went back to their walls and their doors and their silence. The forest watched him all day. At dusk, the first growl rolled out of the dark between the trees, low and resonant, like the earth itself clearing its throat. Then another. Then many. The shadows moved. Kael's gold eyes burned in the failing light, and he did not look away. The monsters came. They did not kill him. That was the first surprise. Dozens of them, shapes that had no business being patient, lowering themselves into the undergrowth at the tree line like dogs settling around a fire. Eyes catching the last of the dusk light, amber, green, the occasional burning red, all of them fixed on Kael, who was still tied. To his post with his wrists going numb and his heart hammering at a speed he was fairly certain wasn't survivable. He didn't speak. Neither did they. Then the alpha came. It emerged from the deep dark between the oldest trees, the ones so thick that 2 men linking hands couldn't circle them, and it moved with a particular unhurriedness of something that had never once needed to rush. Taller than anything Kael had seen. Leaner than the others, built less like a predator and more like a sentence. Its eyes were the color of twin suns, pale gold, and when they found his face, Kael felt something in his chest respond. The sigil beneath his sternum, the faint mark he'd had since birth that his mother had always told him was just a birthmark, pulsed once, warm and electric, like a coal someone had breathed on. The alpha stopped 3 feet away. It studied him with an expression that, horrifyingly, looked like recognition. "You are not prey," it said. The voice arrived not through the air but through the back of his skull, settling into meaning the way a word does when you've known it your whole life but never heard it spoken aloud. Kael's jaw tightened. "Then cut me loose and let me go home." "You have no home. They gave you to us." "I don't belong to you either." The alpha tilted its head. The gesture was almost human, which was worse than if it hadn't been. One long claw extended and tapped, gently, against the center of Kael's chest, right above the sigil, which flared hot at the contact. "You carry our mark," it said. "It was placed before your birth." Kael stared at it. What does that mean? What followed was not a story told with kindness. The alpha spoke plainly, the way something speaks when it has no interest in softening facts. Years ago, before Kael existed, a woman had walked into the Blackwood alone. Desperate. Unable to conceive. She had gone to the oldest part of the forest, where the trees stopped having names and the soil ran black, and she had begged. The forest spirits had not answered. Something else had. Not malevolent. Not benevolent. Ancient, and largely indifferent to human categories of good or evil. It had heard her grief and offered a transaction. A thread of old blood, woven into whatever child she carried. A bridge, the Alpha called it. Not human. Not monster. Something the world occasionally required and almost never survived producing. Kael's mother had said yes. He thought about her face at the door this morning. The way her voice had gone steady at the end, like a rope pulled taut. He thought about his father's grave, which he hadn't seen but somehow already knew was there. She never told me, he said. She protected you. As she could. Kael looked at the sigil glowing beneath his skin, gold against his forearm in the dark. His whole life, everyone had looked at him like a mistake. Even his father, eventually. But the Alpha was looking at him like something inevitable. He wasn't sure which was worse. You could rule us, the Alpha said. With the mark developed, with training, you would have authority over every creature in this forest. They would follow you. Or you could destroy us. Burn the bloodline out of yourself. Become fully human. A pause. We have seen it attempted. It is not a gentle process, and it has never succeeded. There's a third option, Kael said. The Alpha waited. Leave my village alone. Stop the attacks. Just stop. Make us. It said it without malice. A simple statement of reality. The creatures behind it stirred, a sound like wind through dry branches. Kael looked at the Alpha's sun-pale eyes and understood that this was not cruelty. This was an honest assessment. Words would not move them. Authority had to be built. The Alpha's claw sliced through his bonds effortlessly. Train. Learn what you are. When you are ready, challenge me. And if I win? We bow. All of us. The attacks on Elderbrook end. And if I lose? The Alpha smiled. He knew it was a smile, somehow, even without the machinery for one. You become what you were always meant to be. Kael rubbed his wrists and looked back toward the darkness where Elderbrook's distant torchlight bled faintly against the sky. I will never become a monster. Every slayer, the Alpha said quietly, turning back toward the deep forest, carries one inside. He stayed. There was, in the end, no compelling alternative. 7 years in the Blackwood taught him things that had no names in the human language he'd grown up speaking. He learned the monster's tongue, not words exactly, but intention, transferred through cadence and posture and the particular frequency of a growl. He forged blades from iron he found in forest ruins, old enough that no one living remembered building them. He trained his body past the point of ordinary pain and came out the other side of it harder. The sigil was his strangest teacher. It responded to emotion with a consistency that felt almost clinical. Rage made it burn white hot, focus made it steady, grief made it dim to barely a glow. He learned to read it the way a sailor reads weather. He learned, slowly and with significant cost, to influence it back. By 14 he could run the canopy. By 16 he could hear a monster's heartbeat at 30 paces. At 17, he killed his first beast, a mid-sized creature that had been separated from its group and was destroying a section of forest floor in what he now recognized as distress rather than aggression. He stood over it afterward and understood something that hadn't been in the Alpha's initial terms. The monsters were starving. Not for lack of prey. The prey was there. But something was wrong with the forest itself, a corruption moving through the soil like a slow poison, turning the hunting grounds foul, tainting the water, driving the creatures toward the village not from malice but from desperation. The Blackwood was dying from the inside out, and something was killing it. Something deliberate. He pressed his hand to a blackened root and felt it, a wrongness beneath the wrongness, layered deep, like rot beneath rot. Whatever was corrupting the forest hadn't arrived by accident. It was feeding on the chaos. On the fear. On every attack that pushed humans and monsters further into hatred of each other. He didn't know its name yet. He filed this away beside the other things. There was a ridge on the eastern edge of the Blackwood where the tree line broke and you could see Elderbrook's rooftops if the light was right. Kael went there more than he admitted to himself. He watched his mother hang laundry on a line that sagged a little lower each year. Watched her hair go from dark to threaded grey to mostly white. Watched her move more slowly across the muddy square, but always upright, always with that particular quality of stillness that meant she was watching the tree line even when she appeared to be doing something else. She was watching for him. He never stepped out of the trees. His father's grave was in the eastern corner of the village plot, marked with a simple post. No carving. Aldrich had drunk himself to the end of his story 3 winters after Kael had been left at the forest's edge. A passing traveler had told a passing monster, who had told Kael in the flat, affectless way monsters reported facts. Kael had sat with that information for a long time before putting it away. The guilt was not about grief. It was worse. It was about the absence of enough grief. About standing at a ridge watching a village that had tried to sacrifice him and still feeling the pull of it, the longing for something ordinary and small and his. He never let himself want it long enough to do anything about it. The winter of his 18th year arrived early. He knew something was wrong before he saw it. The sigil flared without warning in the middle of the night, burning so bright it lit the inside of his shelter gold. He was outside before he decided to move, blade in hand, scanning the dark. Then he heard it. Not growling. Not the sounds of a hunt. Running. Hundreds of them, crashing through the undergrowth from the deep forest toward the tree line. Every creature in the Blackwood, moving fast in the same direction, toward Elderbrook, yes, but not with purpose. With panic. With the specific, terrible urgency of things that are themselves being chased. Kael stood in the path of it, gold eyes wide, and watched the monsters flee. Behind them, from somewhere deep in the dying heart of the forest, the darkness moved. He could have walked away. That was the truth he carried for the rest of his life, not as shame, exactly, but as ballast. Something to keep him honest. He had stood on the ridge above Elderbrook with 7 years of forest hardening his hands and the sigil cold and quiet beneath his skin, and he had watched the walls come down, and for 30 seconds that felt much longer, he had done nothing. The monsters hit the northern gate first, which collapsed the way it always did, badly, quickly, with a sound like the village's confidence shattering. Then the eastern wall. Then something large and low moved through the gap and the screaming started, and Kael counted torches from the ridge and tried to calculate numbers and told himself this was tactical thinking. It wasn't. He knew what it was. He had been left at a post at the forest's edge with his wrists bound and his mother weeping in a doorway, and the part of him that had filed that away beside his father's grave and his childhood and every silence in every room, that part was asking, in a voice that sounded reasonable, whether these people had earned his bleeding. The Alpha materialized beside him without sound, which Kael had stopped flinching at years ago. They are being driven, it said. Not led. Something is pushing them from behind. I know. This is what we felt in the forest. The corruption. It has moved. I know, Kael said again. They stood together and watched Elderbrook burn in patches, torchlight jumping from roof to roof while the shapes of monsters and people tangled in the square below. He watched the chief swing a sword at something 3 times his size and connect, which did nothing useful. He watched 2 men drag a child out of a collapsed doorway. He watched the mill, rebuilt twice since his childhood, take a hit to the support beam and lean dangerously sideways. Then he saw her. His mother was moving across the square with a broken spear in both hands, headed towards something she had absolutely no chance against, a mid-weight beast that had cornered a family against the trough. She was moving the way she had always moved, that deliberate, unhurried quality that was not bravery so much as a complete refusal to negotiate with fear. Her hair was white now, fully, and she was older than the woman he watched from the ridge, smaller than he remembered from up close. The beast turned toward her. The sigil went from cold to inferno in the space of a single heartbeat. Kael was off the ridge before he'd made the decision. He hit the battlefield like a change in weather. The first monster went down before anyone registered his presence. The second and third in quick succession, blade moving in the patterns he had spent 7 years building into his hands until they lived there permanently, below thought. The sigil burned gold through his shirt, visible in the dark, and that was what people noticed first. The light, moving fast through the chaos, cutting toward the square. What is that? Is that? Is that a person? He reached his mother's attacker and drove it back with 3 strikes that shouldn't have been possible for a human frame. The beast stumbled, retreated, recognized the mark and went still with the particular deference he'd learned to expect, which looked, from the outside, like something unnatural. He turned. His mother was staring at him. Her eyes moved across his face, the gold, which had not changed, which had never changed, and something in her expression did the opposite of breaking. It assembled. Like she had been holding a question for 8 years and the answer had just walked out of the dark. She did not speak. Neither did he. There wasn't time. He's one of them. The voice came from somewhere to his left, male, panicked. Look at his eyes, his monster touched, his controlling them. No, look, he just killed one. He's saving us. How do we know? Kael stopped tracking the voices. He had spent his entire childhood inside that argument and there was no resolving it with words. He moved through the square and let the work speak, and if some people ran from him and others ran toward him, that was fine. That was always how it had been. He reached the center of the square breathing hard, blade dark, the sigil throwing a regular gold light across the snow and the bodies and the broken timber. The Alpha was already there. It stood at the far edge of the square, and it was, for the first time in Kael's experience, not moving, not surveying, just still, in a way that looked almost like what fear would look like on a face that didn't usually make room for it. I did not command this, it said, without waiting for him to ask. I know. Something else did. Something that has been here longer than the forest. Longer than Elderbrook. The ground split. Not metaphorically. Not dramatically, the way things split in stories. It split with a sound like the earth clearing a bone from its throat, a crack that ran from the center of the square outward in 3 directions, and from the gap rose heat and a smell like burnt iron and something underneath that had no name in any language Kael had learned. It came up slowly. Winged. Massive, but not in the way the Alpha was massive, more in the way a storm is massive, filling space that didn't seem like it should contain it. Crowned with bone thorns that curved upward like a grotesque parody of something regal. Its face, if it had one, was a dark convergence, features suggesting themselves and then withdrawing, as though it hadn't bothered to fully commit to a form. The remaining monsters went silent. Then backed away. The Alpha, dropped its head, not fully, but enough. A degree of acknowledgement from something that acknowledged nothing. The Devourer, it said. Kael stared at it. It poisoned the forest, the Alpha continued, voice stripped of its usual authority, flatter now, like a report being delivered under duress. Drove us toward the village. Drove the village toward us. Every attack. Every death. Every year of hatred between your kind and mine. A pause that carried weight. It fed on the fear. Built itself larger on the separation. It needed us at each other's throats because a world where we are enemies is a world where it can move freely. Kael thought about his father's grave. About children calling him Beast Boy. About the elders' faces, cold and certain, as they walked him to the forest's edge. He thought about 7 years of monsters he'd believed were the problem. It engineered all of it, he said. Everything. The Devourer hadn't moved yet. It stood in its crack in the earth and let them look at it, which was its own kind of confidence, the confidence of something that has never encountered a meaningful threat and doesn't expect to start now. Kael turned to the Alpha. Can you fight it? Not alone. Not effectively. How many of yours are still? Enough. He looked at the creature in the square. Looked at the villagers pressed against walls and huddled in doorways. Looked at his mother, still holding her broken spear, watching him with those assembled eyes. He turned back to the Alpha. Then fight beside me. The Alpha was quiet for a moment that felt geological. You would trust a monster. Kael looked at it, the sun-pale eyes, the 7 years, the bargain that had held, the information given plainly without manipulation, the fact that it had come to the ridge tonight before the walls fell and said something is pushing them instead of I am not responsible. I trust a warrior, he said. Something shifted in the Alpha's expression. Not warmth. Something older and more durable than warmth. It turned toward the Devourer. Then we end this. They hit it together. Kael had fought beside monsters before, training bouts, controlled, the alpha pulling force at the last second. This was not that. This was the alpha at full extension, moving like a natural disaster with direction, and Kael alongside it working the angles, reading the Devourer's weight shifts the way he'd learned to read everything in the forest, by watching what it protected. The Devourer was faster than it looked. It took the first exchange without flinching, absorbed 2 strikes from the alpha that should have staggered something its size, and moved through them like weather moves through argument. Kael got inside its reach on the 3rd pass and drove his blade into the joint between wing and torso, felt it connect, felt resistance, felt the Devourer register him for the first time. It turned its knot face toward him, and hit him. The impact was not physical, or not only physical. It went through him the way the alpha's voice went through the back of his skull, arriving as meaning, as pressure behind the eyes, as the sudden overwhelming weight of every dark thing he'd ever considered and set aside. The sigil cracked open with gold fire and then stuttered, and Kael was on his back in the snow with a wound in his shoulder that burned cold rather than hot, and the Devourer standing over him, vast and unhurried. Its voice arrived like the alpha's, interior, immediate, unavoidable. Become, it whispered, what you truly are. The monster blood stirred. He felt it rise, ancient, enormous, patient, exactly the size of the thing the village had always feared he was. It would be easy. It would be sufficient. It would be enough to end this, and it was right there, and all he had to do was stop holding the door closed. The gold light from the sigil flickered, dimmed. The snow around him began to darken. The darkness was not empty. That was the first thing he understood, lying in the snow with the cold burning through his shoulder and the sigil guttering like a candle in wind. The darkness the Devourer had pushed him into was furnished, populated. It had been waiting for him with the particular patience of something that had always known he would arrive eventually. He saw his father first. Aldrich at the kitchen table, cup in hand, staring at the wall. The specific quality of that stare, not at Kael, never quite at Kael, always at the wall slightly to his left, as though looking directly at his son required an effort he had budgeted for other things. The grave with the plain post. No carving. The absence of enough grief and the guilt that lived inside that absence. He saw the elders walking him across the square with his wrists bound, the village watching from doorways, no one stepping forward. He saw the midwife's face at the hut door, ash pale, holding him like something she wasn't sure she should be touching. He saw children crossing the street. He saw the Fenner boy's hands, accepting his timber but refusing his touch on the posts. The monster blood moved through all of it like water finding cracks. They never wanted you, it said. Not the Devourer's voice now, something older, interior, the voice of every conclusion a child draws alone in the dark when no one comes to offer alternatives. Not your village. Not your father. You were an offering. A thing they tied to a post and walked away from. Why are you protecting them? It showed him the other thing. A vision, or a possibility, which was worse, because it felt achievable. Kael standing on the ridge above Elderbrook, but different now, the sigil blazing fully open, the monsters arrayed behind him in numbers that made armies irrelevant. The village below, walls intact, people small and still. The chief on his knees. The elders on their knees. Everyone who had ever pulled their sons inside, everyone who had ever said cursed, every silence in every room, finally and completely reversed. You could have this, the blood murmured. You were always supposed to have this. They made you what you are. Take what they made you for. He stayed with it longer than he should have. Then he heard the other voice. Not loud. Not competing. Just present, the way it had always been present, steady, quiet, the voice of a woman standing in a doorway with a broken spear she had no business carrying. No matter what they call you. He thought about her hair going white. Her moving more slowly across the square each year, but always upright, always watching the tree line. 8 years of watching the tree line. You are my son. Kael understood something in that darkness that he couldn't have understood younger. His mother had known what she'd agreed to in the Blackwood. Had known what he would be, what it would cost, what the village would do. Had stayed anyway. Had stood in doorways and said he is not a problem. He is our son to a man who had already decided otherwise. Had pressed an iron pendant into his palm at the worst moment of both their lives and found steadiness for him when she had none left for herself. She hadn't protected him because he was human. She hadn't protected him because he was monster-touched. She had protected him because he was hers, and because she had looked at him, gold eyes and all, mark and all, everything the village feared and everything his father couldn't face, and decided that what she saw was worth protecting. He was not going to become king of monsters. He was not going to become a monster at all. He was going to become something the darkness in front of him had not accounted for, someone who had been given every reason to choose power over people and had found the people worth more. The sigil stopped flickering. It steadied, not the wild burning of rage, not the dim glow of grief, but something new, something that felt like the difference between a fire that destroys and a fire that lights. Warm and controlled and genuinely, permanently his. Gold light filled the dark. He came back to the snow and the square and the devourer standing over him, and he stood up. It was not dramatic. He simply stopped lying down, which was its own kind of statement. The wound in his shoulder was real and the cold was real and the creature above him was enormous in a way that didn't shrink just because he'd made a decision. But the sigil burned steady on his chest and his hands were not shaking, and when the devourer looked at him with its not face, what it found there made it pause. The alpha hit it from the left. Kael moved right, inside the devourer's reach, where its size became a liability rather than an asset. 7 years of learning to fight things larger than himself had been, he understood now, preparation for exactly this. He read its weight, its rotation, the way it compensated for the alpha's force by shifting left, which opened the right side, which opened the space beneath the wing joint where the corruption ran thickest. He drove his blade in. The sigil's gold light traveled up the steel and into the wound. Not destructive, purifying, burning the corruption away at the source, the same force that had stabilized the mark in the darkness now moving outward through the only real weapon he'd ever had. The devourer's form began losing its coherence, features withdrawing permanently now, the borrowed mass of centuries of manufactured fear dissolving at the edges. It had one thing left. Fear, it said, interior and fading, will always return. Then I'll be here, Kael said, and drove the blade to the hilt. The devourer came apart. Not with violence, with exhaustion, the way a lie collapses when the last person maintaining it lets go. It folded into ash that the snow absorbed before it settled, and then there was just the square and the cold and the silence of a battlefield catching its breath. The monsters retreated. Not fleeing, withdrawing, which was different. Orderly. The corruption that had driven them was gone, and in its absence they moved back toward the Blackwood with something that looked, in the dark, almost like relief. The alpha stepped forward through the thinning chaos. It looked at Kael for a long moment, sun-pale eyes moving across the steady sigil, the wound, the blade, the fact of him still standing. Then it lowered its head until its skull-crowned height bent toward the blooded snow, and it knelt. As promised, it said. Behind it, the remaining monsters knelt. The village was completely silent. Kael turned. The chief was standing 10 feet away, sword still in hand, face doing the complicated arithmetic of a man reassembling his understanding of everything. He was not a coward. Kael had watched him swing at a creature 3 times his size tonight, but he was a man who had been wrong in a very specific and costly way, and he knew it, and he was working out what to do with that knowledge in real time. He sheathed the sword. He knelt. It moved through the villages the way the crack in the earth had moved, outward from a center, one person at a time, until the square was full of people kneeling in the snow around the boy they had tied to a post and abandoned to the dark. Kael didn't say anything. There was nothing adequate, and he had long since stopped needing adequate. Then his mother was there. She crossed the square slowly, which was not hesitation but intention, the deliberate movement of someone who has waited 8 years for 30 feet of ground and is not going to rush the last of it. She stopped in front of him and her hand came up to his face, cold fingers against his jaw, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him in the hut doorway when he was newborn and the midwife was pale and the village was silent. Like he was exactly what she had hoped for. "My brave boy," she said. Kael closed his eyes. Later, when the fires were banked and the wounded were tended and Elderbrook was doing the quiet, exhausted work of surviving another night, the Alpha told him the rest. The Devourer had not been born. It had been summoned, centuries ago, long before Elderbrook had a name, by a group of humans who had wanted a weapon against the monsters of the early Blackwood and had reached for something they didn't understand. They had called the fear up from wherever fear lives when it isn't being used, given it form and will and hunger, and then lost control of it inside a generation. The monsters had not been the origin. Human terror had been the origin. The monsters were what happened after. Kael sat with that for a long time, watching the alpha's face, thinking about his father and the chief and the midwife and every person who had pulled their children inside when he walked past. Thinking about how fear moved through a community like a corruption through soil, quietly, structurally, making the ground unstable long before anything visibly collapsed. Does it change anything? The alpha asked. Knowing. It changes everything, Kael said. And nothing. We still have to do the same work. They offered him the village. Not formally, there was no ceremony, and Kael wouldn't have stayed for one, but the chief came to him at dawn and said that Elderbrook needed a leader and that there was no one alive better suited, and the words were genuine, which made them harder to decline than if they hadn't been. I'll guard the border, Kael said. That's what's needed. Not a leader inside the walls, someone at the threshold. He cleared his father's name quietly, through a conversation with the chief that didn't need to be public to matter. He arranged for his mother to have the largest house on the square, which she accepted without ceremony and immediately began filling with other people's problems, which was exactly right. He took nothing for himself except the forest and the work and the knowledge of what he was. In the years that followed, travelers on the road north began to report a figure at the tree line, seen at dusk, mostly, sometimes at dawn, gold eyes catching the light for just a moment before the shadows took him back. Some said he walked with a massive creature beside him. Some said he walked alone. Some called him cursed. Others called him blessed. In Elderbrook, they didn't argue about it. They had seen what he chose, at the moment when choosing mattered. They had been in the square. They had been kneeling in the snow. When travelers asked what he was, the villagers thought about gold eyes in firelight, and a blade that carried its own light, and a boy who had been handed to the dark and walked back out of it on his own terms. They said his name. They called him cursed. They called him monster. But when darkness came, when the walls fell and the ground split and everything they feared arrived at once, they called his name. Kael. The boy born under a red moon. The one who mastered the beast within. The one who became the monster slayer. That's a wrap on today's tale, and if it moved you, stayed with you, or made you feel something real, then we did our job. Subscribe so you never miss what's coming next, because the best stories are still ahead. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay wild.